Here are 5 controversial reasons why the people of India are glad to see the revolution in Iran. The first point is that Iran's religious inclusivistic history and culture needs to be recovered, and the people are feeling it. Iran is also known as Persia, or in Sanskrit is also known as Parshava, which is the ancient name which predates to more than 3,000 or 4,000 years. Iran is a motherland to 2 famous world religions which have now become extinct and lost in the history books. One which goes back at least 3,500 years, which is Zoroastrianism, foundation of Abrahamic faith, and then another religion which is called Manichaeism, which came a little bit after the Common Era and is also a great influence on the Middle Eastern philosophies. Iran now has become monopolized due to the Islamic conquest, that only people are allowed to follow Islam, or if they follow anything else, then they do not have freedom of speech, they do not have freedom of faith, freedom of assembly, etc. The same thing which happened to Pakistan and the same thing which happened to Afghanistan. People had to abandon the native faiths which originally appeared in the Iranian land due to violent conquest and converting people. They also applied the jizya taxes to suffocate people financially through taxation and financial pressure. This is the history of how Iran became an Islamic country. If you look at the sociology of religion in the modern world, the whole world is monopolized by religious conceptions which come from the Abrahamic faiths of the Arabic Peninsula. And they do not adequately combine with the natural, liberal, broad-minded, synchronistic and open-minded nature of the Iranian people and people that we find in Asia and we also find in the West. Abrahamic faiths, especially Islam, promote a false notion of being pure monotheists, despite the fact that dualism is not a superior form of monotheism. The notion of dualism itself comes from Zoroastrianism, and that is what later came into Middle Eastern tribes and then later manifested in the philosophy of Judaism. We find that the Islamic interpretation of dualism is even more extreme, creating a vast contrast between the intense sinfulness and profanity of the material world and the profound transcendence of God in the spiritual realm. And because of that, there is a lack of respect both for Mother Nature and for the people that inhabit this planet. It's actually very important to have a philosophical form of monotheism, the oneness which underpins everything. Just as in science, there is a notion that energy is what's underpinning all of reality, and energy manifests as matter in different ways. This is what we're learning with the modern research in quantum physics. This extreme sense of dualism which we find in Islam between the material and the spiritual, between the believers and the kafirs, the non-believers, is something which is what we can refer to, as H.D. Goswami says, as a form of uber piety, or a form of superficial, pompous and fatuous pride that we are the only good ones, everyone else is inferior. Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism actually effectively laid the foundation of a lot of the mythology and the doctrines which you find in Abrahamic thought, yet it is very funny and ironic how the same people who borrowed and learned from their ancestors who had different systems of thought, they later came and mowed down all other systems that were existing in Iran at the time. Vaishnava scholars, they talk about the difference between tribal monotheism and philosophical monotheism. Tribal monotheism uses martial force, conversion techniques and manipulation in order to get a larger following or a larger sect of converts. Whereas philosophical monotheism is not so much interested in conversion, big numbers, it's simply interested in finding what is rationally and logically superior and therefore using that higher form of knowledge, improving one's life. So philosophical monotheism simply uses intellectual presentation, which is given respectfully without any brute force, and simply through philosophical rigor, debate and argumentation, the truths can be established. This is what we find in the ancient Vedic culture, which influenced Zoroastrianism itself. In Zoroastrianism, there is a notion of the Ahura Mazda, which is a form of divinity. And we find that same principle in the Rig Veda of Asura, of the ancient gods. Point number 2 is that the linguistic history of Iran proves its roots and shares the ancient culture of India, which is known as Vedic culture. So therefore, the linguistic history of Iran is Indo-European or is connected to the Vedic culture. As I have written in my book, 10 Mantras for Your Soul, I proposed a notion of sociology which is communication is the most effective way in which culture is spread. And when we look at the ancient linguistic formations in Iran, specifically the Avestan language, we find that the Avestan language is connected to the ancient Sanskrit language and they are the same family of languages. The ancient Vedic culture and the ancient Iranian culture have historical roots. Now we see that modern Parsi is a mix of many other words. Many Arabic words have been imported due to religious conversion. But originally we do find that the ancient Avesta or the ancient old Persian Parsi language is connected to the Vedic Sanskrit language. Many things which were present 3,000 years ago in India, such as freedom of religion, freedom of expression, rights for women, rights for animals, respect for foreign people who enter the country, etc. We find that these principles, which were studied by Megasthenes in his book Indica, and how he described India, we find a lot of these cultural principles were also present in the original culture of Iran. That Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Great, who is also known as Kurus in the ancient language of Iran, which is the same as the Kauravas or the Kuru clan, which we find in the Mahabharata, we find that Kurus or Cyrus, he was actually a great Vedic king in terms of his philosophical and social outlook. And he was connected to the Old Testament of Judaism, in which he saved the Jewish people, he brought them back to the Jewish land, he helped them to establish the new temple. And we find so much respect for Kurus that in the Old Testament, in the Torah and in the Tanakh, he is referred to as an anointed one, or he's referred to as a type of prophet. Because as we see, the concept of prophet is not simply a pure devotee of God, like we find the concept of Acharya in the Vedic philosophy, but it's really a person who comes to save God's favored people, the different tribes of the nation of Israel. They are more like political figures. They are more like people who re-establish or protect the Jewish community. So we find that Cyrus, despite not being a believer in Abrahamic faith, he is even taken as a prophet. When we look at the Mahabharata, which is the greatest epic related to India, we find that there are many historical sites which are connected both to Iran and to Afghanistan. So we can see that this ancient connection between Vedic culture and Iranian culture or Parsi culture, Persian culture, goes back much further than the advent of Islam, Christianity or Judaism. Point number 3. Both the original culture of Iran and the original culture of India have a strong principle of protecting women and giving them dignity and giving them freedom. But we can see that in the modern Iranian regime, they are promoting an extremist sense of protection of women to the extent that they actually control them so much that women actually feel uncomfortable and unhappy, and they actually feel abused and disrespected. As Srila Prabhupada said, religion without philosophy is fanaticism or sometimes sentimentalism, and philosophy without religion is just dry mental speculation. There is not a philosophical understanding of how to treat women, it's just a fanatical understanding. Not only that, but you often see leaders banning art, banning music, banning iconography, and banning all forms of cultural expression. Actually, cultural expression such as art and music, they are integral and they are inherent parts of human culture. They are what distinguishes the humans from the animals. The humans have the ability to express themselves in metaphorical, symbolic and artistic ways which the animals cannot do. They are actually, in many forms of ancient spirituality, the specific way by which humans connect with the divine. And although music and art can be misused for material purposes, like we see a lot of pop music, hip-hop, reggaeton, lots of genres, they promote objectification of women, drugs, alcohol, and they promote materialism. We can see, although music can be hijacked to present a negative philosophy, music can also be used to present spirituality. Religion without philosophy becomes fanaticism, because we have to understand what is a principle of art through spiritual philosophy. Art is a tool of sharing a message, sharing a belief, sharing an emotion. And it can be used both negatively and it can also be used spiritually. So the Ayatollah and the Iranian regime at the moment, that because music or material tools can be used to take you away from God, therefore they have to be rejected. Whereas the correct philosophical understanding is what is taught by the amazing medieval saint Rupa Goswami of Yukta Vairagya. Not being attached to things, but using them in a way to connect them to God. So that is the correct principle of how to use art. Therefore, it is completely philosophically unsound to reject the entire realm of human culture and arts simply because art can be misused. The problem is not art or music by themselves, but is the message and the intentions by which they are employed. In contrast, Vaishnava Bhakti culture, strongly grounded in philosophy and deep thought, rather than mere doctrine and dogma, articulates the principle of Yukta Vairagya, the understanding that everything can be used in the service of God and become spiritualized. Of course, this requires discernment and qualification. We are speaking about categories of human activities and how to engage those in spiritual connection or in yoga, to use them in a way to glorify the divine and not take people away from the divine. Point number 4 is that the Iranian regime is promoting a fanatic approach to basic human needs, and that is not what the people want. It is possible to preserve conservative values regarding women without taking them to the far extreme of concealing their entire forms, silencing their voices, denying them personal choice, and denying them access to certain services. Although one has definitely a good point to argue that hierarchy is necessary in social intercourse, often an unnatural hierarchy rooted in power exists within all human social structures, and such hierarchy should never be misused or pushed to the extremes. It must be balanced. A healthy social hierarchy involves not only authority, but care and love, a balance between affection, protection, and instruction. It can be very easily argued that this balance has been completely lost in the case of Ayatollah's rule in Iran, where extremist values are promoted under the banner of protecting women or maintaining a religious social order. In other religions around the world, which also uphold divine gender roles, such as Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and even Buddhism, they also promote values for women, but without taking them to strong extremes. So it is completely unnecessary to do what Ayatollah is doing. Even if it stayed as an Islamic country in Iran, he doesn't need to push the extremes and completely control the opposite sex. Of course, there is a strong argument that Western culture has largely lost its grip on social roles and social fabric of society, resulting in demographic collapse, population collapse, rising abortion rates, widespread intergenerational trauma, and high levels of divorce. But that does not justify, because some things are not doing that well, you should take it to the other extreme and be fanatic on the other extreme. The extreme left is extremely sentimental and they just care about feelings rather than facts. But we find that the extreme right or the extreme conservative values are fanatic. Therefore, as Prabhupada says, philosophy is very important to bring a balance in between the extreme liberals and the extreme conservatives, and to find a balance between the two. A more sustainable position lies somewhere in the middle, in one in which women feel free yet protected, but they are also allowed to be feminine and not forced to be in a constant fight or flight or survival mode like the men. Traditionally, it is men who bear the burden of that mode in order to protect women and children and the elderly, and social structures should reflect this balance rather than collapse it either into chaos or oppression. Point number 5, it is more natural for Iran to be connected to Vedic culture than to Abrahamic culture. People in Iran are suffering from anemoia, which is defined as a hankering to feel something that you've lost in the past. So the Iranian people have a strong hankering to be connected to a more liberal, to a more synchronistic, to a more inclusivistic, tolerant culture, which they have in their blood and their history and their DNA. So the Iranian people feel a strong angst, a strong eagerness to return to the original culture they had before the Islamic invasion which happened in their country. The people in Iran who are very detached from the dogma which has been enforced upon them and who are not scared to speak out, they are all promoting principles such as inclusivism, that there are many different religious traditions and we can respect all of them, that truths can be found in many ways. And we find that many Iranians are taking up processes such as yoga, meditation, and many of them are following the philosophy of omniism, which is that there are many religions and all have some truths, so you take all of them as being useful. So we find that this is the natural state of the Iranian people. The benighted fanaticism of the extreme Islamists has basically created one of the unhappiest countries in the world, with people running away whilst the government are thinking they're doing something good and establishing God and godliness in the country. Just think about this. How can making your own countrymen suffer, be unhappy, and want to run away from their own country be the right way to deal with your own people? And how can that be something that is good?